Picture the lowcountry fog rolling in like judgment itself. A plain pine coffin, still smelling of fresh-cut resin, is carried off a wagon and placed in the woodshed. The man it was built for watches from the tree line. Elias is still breathing. Still swinging his hammer. He has 42 days left on this earth. No one will ever write down why that coffin arrived so early. But the marsh remembers. And tonight, so will you. Now step with me into the autumn of 1859. The air on St. Helena Island carried a weight that season. Not just the usual salt and sulfur of the Pluff mud, but something heavier, older, as though the land itself had grown tired of secrets. Live oaks dripped silver Spanish moss like mourning veils. Herons stood motionless in the creeks, white sentinels that seemed to judge every soul who passed. And on the western edge of the island, hidden behind a tunnel of ancient trees, sat Heron's Rest. You would not have found the name on any grand map. The plantation was never meant to be famous, it was meant to be profitable. 2,000 acres of long staple Sea Island cotton, the kind that fetched top dollar in Liverpool. 34 souls in bondage. One master who had never been supposed to inherit it. Wendell Drayton was 44 that October. Second son. Lawyer by training, planter by sudden, unwanted fate. When yellow fever took his older brother Robert in 1851, the entire weight of Heron's Rest dropped onto shoulders never measured for it. 8 years later those shoulders were still tense. You could see it in the way he walked the fields at dusk, back straight, jaw locked, eyes scanning the horizon as if the next hurricane, the next market crash, or the next slave revolt might rise out of the marsh any moment. His wife Catherine kept the household ledgers in a small mahogany desk by the east window. Her handwriting was tiny, perfect, merciless. Every bolt of cloth, every pound of pork, every yard of cotton ginned, she recorded it. She also recorded things no one asked her to, the number of lashes given on a Tuesday, the exact hour a child's fever broke, the nights Wendell sat alone in the study with an open bottle and a closed ledger. She wrote everything down because she had learned the only armor a planter's wife possessed was knowledge wrapped in silence. And then there was Elias. 51 years old, or close enough. No birth record existed, the law had never cared when he drew his first breath, only that he keep drawing it until his body was no longer useful. But Elias knew his own timeline the way a carpenter knows the grain of cypress. He had been born after the big house foundations were laid and before the 1812 cotton storehouse fire. He remembered carrying water to the men driving the pilings for the new dock, water so cold it numbed his small hands. That was how he counted years, against the memory of calluses, against the sound of hammers, against the weight of loss. He was the plantation carpenter. The one who rebuilt the dock after the 1845 hurricane so it laughed at the next storm. The one who framed the new east wing after the mysterious 1847 fire so seamlessly that only he knew where the old wood ended and the new began. His hands were broad, scarred at the knuckles, palms mapped with white lines from chisels and awls. When he rested them, they curled slightly inward, as though still cradling an invisible piece of lumber, waiting for the next perfect joint. By the spring of 1859 those hands had begun to betray him. It started as a cough that rattled like dry leaves in the wind. Then came the nights when he woke tasting copper. Then the mornings he could not rise without Nora's arm under his. Dr. Harlan Voss, the same physician who treated the Drayton family, wrote out every few weeks. His notes were clinical, detached, progressive wasting of the lungs. Expect marked decline by harvest. Prognosis, grave. Elias did not need the doctor's words. He could read his own body the way he read a warped plank, feel where the strength was leaving, where the grain of life was splitting. He said almost nothing. But one humid August night, lying on the narrow bed he shared with Nora in their cabin at the edge of the quarters, he spoke the truth that had been growing inside him like a cancer. "They will not let me die quiet, Nora." She turned to him in the dark. 30 years of marriage, the kind the law refused to name, but God and the Gullah people had blessed anyway, had taught her to listen without interrupting. Elias continued, voice hoarse but steady. "Master Wendell, he carries debt heavier than any of us know. The cotton prices keep falling. The bank in Charleston writes letters that make him pace the porch till sunrise. And a dying carpenter is still worth something on paper. But a dead one can be buried cheap. Unless. He let the silence finish the sentence. Nora's hand found his in the dark. Unless what, Elias? Unless he needs the world to see he did right by me. A proper coffin. A proper burial. Proof to the neighbors, to the bank, to his own guilty conscience that he is not the monster the North keeps calling us all. He laughed once, a dry sound that turned into a cough. Or maybe the Lord is letting him see his own grave being dug ahead of time. Same way Pharaoh saw the plagues coming and still hardened his heart. They lay in silence after that, listening to the marsh breathe, the soft slap of water against the creek bank, the distant hoot of an owl that sounded almost like a warning. 6 weeks before Elias would draw his last breath, the coffin arrived. Tuesday, October 9, 1859. The first real chill of the season had slid in off the Atlantic overnight. Mist clung to the live oaks like ghosts reluctant to leave. A mule cart creaked up the shell road just after dawn. The driver was a quiet German named Gerhard Schein, coffin maker and furniture builder for half the planters in Beaufort district. In the back of the cart lay a long pine box, simple, honest, devastating in its ordinariness. No carved roses. No brass nameplate. Just good straight-grained pine, plain smooth, iron handles bolted solid, lid fitted so tight you could hear the air hush when it closed. The kind of coffin made for function, not for show. The kind made when the customer says, "Build it strong. He will need it soon." Elias was repairing a shutter on the smokehouse. When the cart rolled past, he lowered the hammer slowly. Watched 2 field hands help Schein unload the box and carry it into the woodshed where he himself kept his tools. The same woodshed where he had spent thousands of hours shaping cypress into beauty. He did not speak. He simply stood there, sweat cooling on his brow, and stared at the place where his death now waited for him in plain sight. Later that morning, when the hands had gone back to the fields and Schein's cart had rattled away, Elias walked into the woodshed alone. The coffin rested on 2 sawhorses he had built himself years earlier. Sunlight slanted through the cracks in the wall and laid golden bars across the pine. He ran his fingertips along the edge, perfect joinery, better than most men could manage. For a moment the craftsman in him felt pride. Then the man in him felt something colder. He lowered his forehead until it touched the lid. "Lord," he whispered, voice barely louder than the wind in the moss, "you let them build my bed before I need to lie in it. Why? So I can look my end in the face every single day? So I can finish the work you gave me before I meet you?" A tear slipped down his cheek and landed on the wood, darkening a small circle. Outside, the marsh kept its counsel. The herons stood watch. Somewhere in the big house, Wendell Drayton sat over his ledger, unaware that the most expensive single purchase he had made all year now sat waiting for the only man on the plantation whose hands could have built a finer coffin himself. And in that woodshed, a dying carpenter made a decision that would outlive slavery, outlive the war, outlive every soul who walked those fields in 1859. He would not go quietly into that pine box. He would leave something behind that no ledger could ever record. Something the marsh would guard. Something the world would one day have to reckon with. But that part of the story is still coming. Now come inside the small house at the edge of Heron's Rest. The night is thick with October chill. The marsh exhales its sulfur breath through every crack in the walls. Henry and George carried the coffin that Tuesday morning. 2 young men from the quarters, strong-shouldered, quiet-eyed. Overseer Corwin had barked the order at first light, "Meet the cart at the main road. Bring whatever it is to the woodshed. Move quick." He gave no name to the cargo. He didn't have to. When they lifted the long pine box, the weight told them everything. Henry felt the smooth plain sides, the iron handles cold against his palms. He met George's eyes over the lid. "This a coffin," Henry whispered. George's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the cabin where Elias and Nora lived, 60 feet away, close enough to smell the wood smoke from their chimney. "Who for?" George asked, voice barely above the crunch of shell path under their boots. Henry didn't answer right away. He already knew. The dimensions. The timing. The way the master had been watching Elias lately, like a man appraising livestock he might have to put down. "Elias," Henry said finally. They set the coffin on the sawhorses inside the woodshed. The same woodshed where Elias had taught himself angles and mortises, where he had planed cypress until it sang under his blade. Now Death sat in the middle of his workshop like an unwelcome apprentice. Wendell Drayton watched the whole thing from the rear porch. Coffee cup forgotten in his hand, steam long gone. He raised one finger, barely a motion, and pointed toward the shed. Henry and George obeyed without a word. When they emerged empty-handed, Wendell sent them back to the cotton rows with the same economical flick of his wrist. Then he stayed. Alone. Staring at the closed woodshed door as though willing it to stay shut forever. The marsh wind moved around him, carrying the faint rot of pluff mud and the sharper bite of coming frost. He drained the cold coffee in one swallow. Turned. Went inside. Upstairs in the sewing room, Ada saw it all through the second-floor window. She was 43, born on this land, raised in its shadow. She knew herons rest the way blood knows veins, every creak of floorboard, every sigh of the big house settling at dusk, every mood that drifted down from the master's study like smoke. 11 years she had served Catherine Drayton, hemming dresses, brushing hair, arranging the silver, becoming furniture herself, useful, silent, unseen. That morning she had been bent over a torn muslin sleeve when the cart rattled past. She lifted her eyes just in time to watch the long box carried toward the woodshed. She watched Wendell's face. Not sorrow. Not pity. Satisfaction. The small, tight knot of a man who has crossed one disagreeable item off a long mental list. Ada set the needle down. Her hands, steady for years, trembled once. She sat motionless for a full minute, letting the knowledge settle inside her like sediment in a tidal creek. Quick action was a white man's privilege. For her, knowledge had to ripen. She turned it over. The doctor's visits growing longer. Wendell's question to Corwin last month, what can he still do day to day? Spoken in the careful tone of a man weighing coin against flesh. Elias's slow steps lately, the way he paused to catch breath after climbing 3 stairs. A coffin ordered while the man still hammered nails. She finished her work. Face calm. Expression blank as fresh planed pine. Returned the mended dress to Catherine's wardrobe. "Good night, ma'am," she said in the hallway, voice soft as always. Down the back stairs. Through the kitchen. Past the herb garden silvered with first frost. Straight to Nora's cabin. Nora was alone. Elias slept early now, exhaustion pulling him under before the sun finished setting. His breathing came shallow, rhythmic, like waves lapping marsh grass. Ada sat across the rough pine table. The single lamp burned low, wick guttering. She told Nora everything. The cart. The coffin. Wendell's gaze lingering on the shed door like a man guarding a secret vault. Nora listened without interrupting. When Ada finished, Nora spoke quietly. He already knows. Ada waited. He told me weeks ago what he thinks they planning, Nora continued. He said the master needs him gone on paper before the body's cold. Needs a clean ledger. Needs the debt collectors to see one less asset to seize. The lamp flame danced. Outside, palmetto fronds rattled dry and urgent. Ada leaned forward. What does he need from us? Nora's eyes were steady. Time. And someone willing to carry what he writes. To grasp what Elias believed and what he feared requires stepping inside the cold arithmetic of 1859. In South Carolina law, an enslaved person was not a person at all. He was chattel. Collateral. A figure entered in red or black ink beside plows and breeding mares. Elias, in his prime, had been valued at $1,200, more than many a white man earned in a decade. A skilled carpenter could repair docks, frame houses, build coffins better than most free men. By autumn 1859, illness had shaved that value to $850. Still too much to lose. Still worth saving, if only on paper. Wendell Drayton was drowning in red ink. A $3,000 loan from Charleston factor Hollis Crane in 1856, secured against future cotton bales that never materialized in sufficient number. Bad seasons. Falling prices. Revised terms. And buried in the fine print, the right to demand liquidation of human property if payments lagged. Drayton had perhaps 1 year before Crane called the note. Selling Elias while he was still healthy would have fetched the best price. But Elias was dying. And South Carolina courts had spent 20 years building case law around the warranty of soundness. Sell a man you know is consumptive, watch him die within months, and the buyer could sue for fraud. Damages could swallow the plantation whole. But what if Elias were already dead on paper? File a death certificate now. Let Dr. Voss attest to it. Remove the name from the asset list. Erase the liability. Keep the living man working invisibly as long as lungs held out. When breath finally stopped, slide the body into the waiting coffin. Bury it. The dates would align close enough. No one would question a planter who buried his faithful carpenter with dignity. It was elegant. Merciless. And it depended on one unbreakable assumption. That the people who lived in the quarters would stay silent. That their eyes saw nothing. That their tongues carried nothing beyond the property line. Elias had spent 30 years proving that assumption wrong. He could read. He could write. No one in the big house suspected. The man who taught him was Daniel Primus, freeborn in Baltimore, kidnapped south in the 1830s, sold to settle a debt. Daniel carried literacy like contraband gold. For 3 years he passed it to Elias in fragments. Letters scratched on scrap lumber. Words whispered while planing boards. Sentences practiced at midnight, charcoal erased by dawn. When Daniel was sold away in 1836, Elias kept going alone. Newspapers discarded in the woodshed. Singed book pages salvaged from the 1847 fire. Every scrap became schoolroom. By 1859 his hand was slow but sure. Spelling uneven. Grammar his own invention. But the mind behind the words was clear as marsh water after rain. 11 nights he worked. After Nora pretended to sleep. By stolen candlelight so dim the glow never leaked through door cracks. Paper begged, borrowed, pilfered. Blank ledger sheets. Discarded envelopes. Pages torn from old copybooks. He began. With facts he had seen himself. The coffin's arrival October 9th. Dr. Voss's visits lengthening, questions sharpening. Wendell's inquiry to Corwin about Elias's daily output. A letter passed to a Beaufort writer. Elias had watched it from the woodshed window, unable to read the address but noting the seal, the haste. Then inferences. Carefully labeled as such. The plantation's quiet economies, fewer tools ordered. Labor shifted to cheaper hands. The Savannah factor who no longer came to dinner. Then older sins. The 1854 sale of brothers Aaron and Marcus Ledger recorded $450 each, but Elias, repairing a windowsill nearby, heard $600 spoken aloud. A discrepancy that, over years, could mean tax evasion. The woman named Mattie on the neighboring Pringle place. Wendell's visits too frequent, too long. Catherine's ledger showing market purchases on days her husband was elsewhere. The 1847 fire. Elias working late in the woodshed that night. Saw someone slip from the east wing carrying a lantern and a small iron box. Saw who it was. Said nothing then. Said nothing for 12 years. Until now. 22 pages. Different sizes. Different shades of paper. Written front and back in places. Every sentence measured. Every accusation anchored in what he had witnessed. When the final word dried, Elias folded the pages. Tied them with a scrap of twine. Hid them beneath a loose floorboard he himself had fitted years before. He looked at Nora in the dark. She had not slept. She had listened to every scratch of the quill. Tomorrow, he whispered, you give this to Ada. She'll know who to trust beyond these gates. Outside, the marsh kept breathing. The herons stood like white witnesses. And in the woodshed, the pine coffin waited, patient, empty, certain. But Elias had just made sure it would not be the only thing that outlived him. The handwriting was not elegant. It never needed to be. Elias had taught himself in stolen moments, charcoal on scrap lumber, midnight practice erased by dawn. The letters leaned like marsh grass in wind. The lines marched straight because he willed them to. He had divided the pages into sections with headers of his own making. Things seen. Things heard. Things done. Things believed. On the 11th night he read it aloud to himself, lips moving, voice a rasp against the candle flame. A man who learned late reads with his whole body. He corrected margins in tiny script. Added 3 sentences to the fire of 1847, details he had held 12 years like hot coals. Then he folded the pages in thirds, the precise crease that would let them lie flat inside the doubled lining of a basket without betraying their shape. He called Nora from the narrow back room where she had been pretending to sleep. She sat across the rough table. The candle threw their shadows tall against the cabin wall. He told her everything, section by section, plain as pine. If the papers were lost or taken, the knowledge still had to live somewhere. In her memory. In her silence. In the way she would carry it forward. When he finished, Nora asked the question she had held through every word. "What do you want this to do?" Elias looked at the folded stack between them. "I want it somewhere he can't burn it. Somewhere he can't reach. And I want the right person to know it exists." He paused. The marsh outside breathed slow and heavy. "Then the rest ain't mine to decide. I can only put truth where it can be found. What happens after, that belongs to whoever finds it." He touched the pages once more. "I built things on this land 30 years. Docks that held against hurricanes. Frames that married old wood to new so seamless you had to know where to look for the seam. They put their name on every board. I never got to put mine." His voice dropped lower. This is the one thing I build that carries my name. Even if no eye ever sees it. Even if it goes nowhere. I made it. It's true. It exists. They can't take it back." Nora placed her hand over his. They sat until the candle guttered out and left them in darkness scented with tallow smoke and pluff mud. Thursday morning, 8 days before the appraiser would ride in, Nora passed the folded pages to Ada in the shadow of the smokehouse. No words. Only eyes meeting, a small nod, the weight of trust transferred like live coals. Ada received it the way she received every danger. Quiet. Face still. Attention absolute. She understood the cost. In 1859 South Carolina, a woman caught carrying words like these could vanish into a Georgia rice field or worse, whipped until the skin peeled, sold south, children taken first. She did not keep it in her cabin. She did not hide it anywhere on Heron's Rest that could be searched. She sewed the pages into the inner lining of her large sweetgrass basket, the one she coiled herself in the old Gullah way, sweetgrass, bulrush, longleaf pine needles, tight as prayer. Flat-bottomed. Strong. Double-folded lining created a narrow pocket no bigger than a man's handspan. No bulge. No tell. She had carried smaller secrets before, herbs for a fevered child on another plantation, a name whispered for someone running north. The basket had always returned empty of danger. That Thursday she loaded it onto the plantation cart bound for Beaufort. Took her usual place in the back. Watched St. Helena slip away behind her, live oaks silvered with moss, tidal creeks gleaming like pewter knives. The road to the mainland smelled of salt and horse sweat. Beaufort Market was alive that morning. Thursday was the pulse of the county. Planters in broadcloth, wives in silk, household women with baskets, free black draymen shouting orders, enslaved people sent with produce to sell under watchful eyes. Ada set up in her spot near the waterfront end, preserved okra, wild honey from the hive line, sweetgrass mats and coiled bowls that always sold to white housewives who prized the craftsmanship without ever asking who made them. Thomas Waring was there with his mule and cart, hauling rice sacks to the warehouse row. 38. Born free to a mother who never bowed and a father who bought his own manumission in 1821. He could read. He could write. Sunday school lessons from a white Methodist minister before the laws slammed shut in the 1830s. He knew every back road, every watched ferry, every warehouse corner where words could pass unseen. He was a quiet junction in a nameless network, free black to enslaved, island to mainland, coast to Charleston, whispers stretching toward Philadelphia if the need grew sharp enough. Ada never approached him straight. She waited for the natural lull mid-morning, crowd thinning, eyes elsewhere. She walked her basket to the corner where his mule drank. Set it beside the water bucket as though resting weary arms. Spoke 3 idle words to the man filling the trough. Picked up the basket. Moved on. An hour later Thomas returned to reload. In the bucket, weighted by a smooth river stone, lay the oilcloth-wrapped packet, papers dry, ink still holding fast. He dried them again under canvas. That evening, in the back room of the Free Black Methodist Church on Port Republic Street, he sat alone under a single lamp. Read every page twice. Sat in silence after. He knew Beaufort's architecture of fear better than most. Freedom on paper did not mean safety in the street. A free black man could be re-enslaved on a technicality, a rumor, a bad season. What he held was different. Not a plea. Not contraband. A lever. A single document that, if placed under the right eye, could shift the balance of power in one man's debt, one man's conscience, one man's ledger. He reread the coffin dates. The doctor's visits. The 1854 sale discrepancy. Mattyon. The Pringle place. The fire. Then he wrapped the pages in fresh oilcloth against the damp. Hid them behind a loose board in the church wall, a hiding place used only for things that could not wait. By morning he knew what path to take. It would require 6 more days of careful steps. If the weight of this is settling on you, if you're wondering how much darkness one sheet of paper can carry, share this video. Like it if the chill reached you. Drop your theories in the comments. What would you do with those pages? The story turns now. November 14, 1859. 4 days before the document reaches an attorney's hands. 9 days before Elias breathes his last. Edwin Tabb rode in alone on a lean bay mare. Mid-morning. Low November sun slanted across the marsh, turning tidal creeks to molten lead, dead cotton stalks to bronze pillars. 50 years old. Dry. Practical. Leather case with brass clasps worn smooth from years of appraisals. A letter from Hollis Crane in his breast pocket. Wendell read it in the front hall while Tabb waited in the parlor. Brief. Precise. Crane's man. Appraisal of assets. Access to records and personnel expected as courtesy. Wendell folded the letter. Pocketed it. Stood motionless a long moment, internal arithmetic flashing behind his eyes. Then he entered the parlor. Warm handshake. Offered dinner, a bed, full access starting dawn. Tabb accepted. Dinner that night was careful theater. Catherine at the table's end, silent unless addressed, voice soft, practiced. Talk of cotton futures, Washington rumors, late-season manuring. Tabb asked sharp questions that sounded nearly curious. Wendell answered with measured generosity, revealing nothing extra. Catherine never mentioned the ledger in the study. Afterward Tabb retired. Wendell sat in his dark study 30 minutes without a lamp. Listening to the house settle. To his own pulse. Next morning Tabb walked the grounds with Corwin. The overseer spoke little, exactly as instructed, which told its own story. Fields. Outbuildings. Kitchen. Stables. Tabb's pencil moved in his small journal, each note a small assertion of authority. He reached the woodshed last. Opened the door. Stood in the threshold letting eyes adjust to sawdust gloom. Smell of fresh-cut pine, old shellac, linseed oil. Tools hung in perfect order, each peg, each bracket, the way Elias kept them.
Bench clean. Half-finished chair frame gathering dust, weeks untouched. Against the far wall, the coffin. Plain pine. Iron handles. Fitted lid.
Tab stepped forward. Laid one palm flat on the wood, testing solidity, temperature, truth.
Withdrew it. Wrote a single line in his journal. Closed the door. Continued.
That afternoon he asked for the ledger.
Wendell brought it himself, unusual. Set it on the parlor table. Sat opposite with untouched tea. Tab turned pages methodically. Found Elias, $8.50. Voss's note. Coffin delivery dated 6 weeks prior. Cross-referenced dates. Cleared his throat once.
Upstairs, Ada mended curtains in the hallway directly above, task assigned that very day. She heard pages turn.
Heard silence thicken. Heard Wendell ask, something in particular? Heard Tab reply, I believe I have what I need for the preliminary report. I'll draft it tonight.
The silence that followed was not empty. It was two men recognizing a card had been seen but not yet played.
Tab left November 16th. Rode to Beaufort.
Mailed his report from the post office that afternoon.
2 observations that would unravel everything. First, the plantation's most valuable single asset visibly dying, coffin already present, death imminent. Second, a single question, placed in the final paragraph like an afterthought.
Why was a coffin delivered more than a month before the death it was intended for, while the man remained alive and valued at full price?
Hollis Crane received it November 20th. Read it twice in his Charleston office. Set it down. Stared at the wall a long time.
A man in his position could not afford even the appearance of complicity in forged documents. Proximity to scandal was poison. The final week of November moved like tide racing out, fast, irreversible.
November 22nd, one day before Elias's death, Thomas Waring met James Ellison in a waterfront warehouse backroom. Empty on Tuesdays. Dim light under the door.
Ellison, late 40s, Beaufort-born, Columbia-trained, was no abolitionist.
He was methodical. Discreet. Understood leverage better than most. He had helped free black clients before, quiet deeds, modest fees.
Waring handed over the oilcloth packet.
Ellison read every page, turning irregular sheets in the low light. Leaned forward over a crate. When he finished,
this was written by Elias himself.
Yes. And he witnessed these things. He was careful. What he saw. What he concluded. It's in how he wrote it. Ellison sat back. Looked at the rafters, damp shadows patterning old boards. I can't use this in court. You know that. I know. But courts aren't the only place things get resolved. He thought through the geometry.
Pressure points, motives, reputations worth more than money to certain men. If someone with interest in this dead learned, through proper channels, that certain information was circulating, information that could complicate settlement in inconvenient ways,
how do you think he'd respond? Waring answered quietly. Depends what he values more, the money, or his name. Ellison smiled, small, dry. For men like that, those are usually the same thing. James Ellison stood. Hat in hand. Hand on the warehouse latch.
I'm going to need to move very carefully, he said.
And you need to understand, I do this as your attorney. What passes between us is protected. You are my client in this. Thomas Waring nodded once. Understood. The document stays with you. Not with me. Understood. Ellison paused at the door. November light slanting thin and cold under the eaves. The man who wrote this, will he live long enough to see how it ends? Probably not. Ellison looked down at the latch as though it held the answer. No. I don't suppose that changes anything, does it? He stepped into the afternoon.
The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. Elias left this world on November 23, 1859, at approximately 4 in the morning. The wind off the Atlantic had turned bitter overnight, sliding through every crack in the cabin walls, pooling cold at floor level like water seeking low ground. The single candle they kept burning guttered, steadied, guttered again. Outside, the marsh at low tide held its breath, water neither still nor moving, silent as judgment waiting to be spoken. Ruth sat on one side of the narrow bed. 60 years old. She had kept vigil for the dying longer than memory reached, not assigned, not paid, but called to it by the quiet gravity communities recognize in certain souls. She knew how to sit with death without crowding it. Nora on the other side. Hand resting on Elias's chest, feeling each labored rise and fall. In his final hours he drifted in and out of lucidity. When clear, his voice carried a calm Ruth later described as rare, not defiance, not desperation, but the deliberate clarity of a man who has completed his labor and now walks the last few steps with purpose. He spoke to Ruth first. Not prayers. Not pleas. Names. Ada. Thomas Waring. He described exactly as Nora had relayed from Ada, who had it from Waring, the location of a loose board in the back wall of a certain Free Black Methodist church on Port Republic Street in Beaufort. He explained what those names and that place meant when spoken together. Hold them, he said. Hold them in your memory until the time comes when they're no longer needed. Then he turned to Nora. What passed between them in those final minutes Louisa Ames would hear years later, but chose out of a tenderness she noted in her margin not to transcribe in full. Only a fragment survives in her hand. He told her the work was done. Between one slow pull of marsh wind and the next, Elias stopped breathing. Nora made no sound. Ruth kept her hands folded in her lap and watched the candle flame steady as the wind outside dropped. 60 feet away in the woodshed, the pine coffin waited, 6 weeks in place, iron handles dull in the pre-dawn gloom. Dawn came cold and pale blue over the marsh. Henry and George carried the box out again, the same two who had brought it in. They moved without words. Other men from the quarters joined them, lifting it toward the small house in the practiced rhythm of people who have buried their own under skies that offered no permission. The people gathered the way they always gathered for death. In their Sunday best, the one good set of clothes saved against exactly this need. Women sang low hymns in Gullah, voices weaving through the chill like smoke. Men who had known Elias longest stood nearest the door, carpenters, field hands, fishermen who had worked beside him, learned from him, watched his hands shape wood into permanence. The ceremony stretched long enough to honor the life it closed. Wendell Drayton did not appear. No white face from the big house came near. They carried the coffin to the burial ground at the property's edge, a quiet row of mounds older than the main house, older than most living memory. Graves marked by fieldstones, shells, sometimes nothing at all. Elias's was the only one that day lowered into earth inside planed pine with iron handles. The only coffin in that line of resting places. November 23, 1859. 3 miles away in Beaufort, James Ellison sat in his office. Afternoon Post. He wrote a letter to Charleston. No accusations. No direct claims. Only careful indirection, the art of a man who knew how leverage worked without ever touching the lever himself. He suggested that certain information had reached attentive ears in Beaufort County concerning the administration of a Sea Island plantation in which Mr. Crane held substantial interest. Information not yet public, but of a character that might draw notice from interested parties if it circulated further. Given the delicacy, a swift and mutually agreeable resolution of the outstanding obligation might serve everyone best. He signed. Sealed. Sent. 4 days later Crane's secretary replied. Brief. Polite. Mr. Crane appreciated the communication. He was prepared to discuss revised terms he believed both sides would find satisfactory. Letters and intermediaries moved for 2 weeks. On December 19, 1859, the settlement was signed. The debt dissolved. Terms far gentler than Crane would have offered without pressure. The clause allowing forced sale of human property gone. Filed as routine commercial business. Elias never knew. He died 26 days before the ink dried. Nor did Nora, Ada, Thomas, Ruth, or Ellison see the full arc in their lifetimes. They worked in fragments, each guarding one piece, trusting the others held theirs with the same care. That trust under a system built to shatter it was the true miracle.
The war came faster than anyone expected.
November 7, 1861, Union gunboats filled Port Royal Sound. Beaufort planters fled in panicked caravans of carriages and trunks. Wendell, Catherine, their children, one carriage, no farewells.
Gone to the mainland. To the Confederacy they had bet everything on. Heron's Rest stood. The people who had built it stayed. They organized. They negotiated with Union officers. They worked the cotton fields they had always worked, now under terms they helped shape.
Among the first formerly enslaved communities in the South to claim partial control of the land they had bled into,
Ada was among the first to register.
She stood before a Union clerk. Gave her name clearly: Ada, formerly of Wendell Drayton, Heron's Rest, St. Helena Island.
Age 43. Occupation, seamstress. Status, free. Intended to remain so.
The officer noted her calm.
Her precision.
The way she answered without flourish, as though freedom was not a gift being granted, but a fact being acknowledged on paper. In spring 1862 she entered the freedmen's schools of the Port Royal experiment.
Night classes. Sunday classes. Adults learning beside children. She sat at desks made for smaller bodies. Practiced letters on slates with the fierce focus of someone reclaiming what had been forbidden. Louisa Ames arrived late winter 1862, one of the first Northern teachers. She met Ada in a classroom.
Ada writing the same sentence over and over, careful, determined, imperfect but unyielding. Over months, then years, they became more than teacher and student.
Friends. The kind who could sit in silence and both find meaning in it. Across conversations in 1862 and 1863, Ada told her everything. The coffin ordered early. The document written in secret.
The chain of hands that carried it off the island. She told it plainly: caretaker passing something precious to someone who might know what to do with it.
Louisa wrote it down. Pencil on thin, damp paper. Margins filled with questions. Names to chase. Facts still needed.
She spoke to Ruth, still on the island, early 60s now. Ruth repeated Elias's last words exactly, 4 years unaltered.
Thomas Waring came in summer 1863. Beaufort under Union control long enough for safe travel. He sat with Louisa in the school garden. Told his part, warehouse meeting, letter to Crane. The document still existed, oilcloth wrapped, safe.
After the war, when laws clarified, he would see if it could speak formally.
Louisa asked if Elias knew the plan succeeded. Waring paused. Settlement December 19th. He died November 23rd. He didn't know. Another pause. But I think he knew it would work. Not certainty.
He built it the way he built anything.
Calculated the load, placed the joints, braced the stress points. He built it to hold. Louisa wrote the word in the margin beside it. True. She left St. Helena spring 1865. War winding down. Future shifting to Washington. She carried her notes in a leather satchel, one of 3 bags she could take on the boat. In later years she tried to place the story. Journals. Newspapers. Reform volumes on the Sea Islands. They wanted drama. Verification. A single triumphant scene. This was too quiet. Too patient.
Too true to the granular texture of bondage and resistance.
She boxed the notes. Stored them. They passed to family in Massachusetts. To a university archive.
Labeled with her name and dates.
Waiting. The settlement paper rests today in the South Carolina Historical Society. Manila folder. Unremarkable. Date. Parties. Terms. Mutual releases. Signatures. No explanation. Wendell lost Heron's Rest in 1862 Union direct tax on Confederate property. Seized for non-payment. He resettled in Columbia.
Practiced diminished law in a diminished world.
Died 1871. General decline. Catherine outlived him 11 years.
Returned near Beaufort after the war. Lived with relatives.
Never went back to St. Helena. Died 1882. No public word on 1859. The coffin. The scheme.
One late entry in Louise's notes, from a woman who worked the Drayton household after the war, hinted obliquely.
Mrs. Drayton kept very good records. She always knew what the ledger said.
Implication: her meticulous entries were not obedience.
They were control. A private archive.
A thread Louisa noted but could not pull to its end. The burial ground endured.
Families who bought land in the 1863-64 sales kept it. Knew the names. Knew the rows.
Knew which mound held Elias. 30 years later, early 1890s, a man raised on former Heron's Rest land told a young Georgia teacher about the carpenter buried in the only coffin. She wrote a letter north describing it arresting, strange. Preserved by chance.
Now in a Southern University archive.
Beside weightier documents no one reads.
It says,
there was a man named Elias,
carpenter,
buried in a coffin ordered before he died. The person who told me said the coffin had been meant for something else.
Elias knew. He found a way to take it back.
He was the only one buried that way. No one ever explained it publicly.
The people who know keep it for themselves.
But they say the coffin was his.
He decided what it was for. In one archive, the settlement waits silent about its cost.
In another, the teacher's notes wait quiet about their power. Elias built one last thing.
Not with hammer and plane. With stolen paper. Stolen light. Stolen hours.
Words.
Truth. The most powerful act a man with nothing could perform. To name what was done in darkness.
And send that naming beyond reach of fire or whip.
What do you make of that choice? Of a dying man who turned a tool of erasure into testimony? Of truth outliving the ledger that tried to bury it alive? Tell me in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight?
If this stayed in your bones, if it makes you wonder what other quiet victories still wait in boxes and attics, share this.
Like it. Subscribe. Hit the bell. History isn't only battles and proclamations. Sometimes it's one man, one candle, one page at a time. See you in the next one.